Welcome back to Welsh Miniature Board Gamer, and today we're going to have a go at painting up these guards from Traitors Toll. So this is going to be kind of a review of the miniatures and how I painted them up. So as a review, I'm going to say that these plastics are really good. I think Wargames Atlantic has really hit the ball out of the park recently with their miniatures. They're really high detailed. The scale seems right, which was something that I had a little bit of a problem with some of their earlier stuff, like Cannon Fodder, where the head seemed way too big for their bodies, etc. But these miniatures now, I think Wargames Atlantic really have raised the bar for their quality, etc. Yes, there is some cleanup. You can see me doing the cleanup on these miniatures, but that's mostly to do with me when I'm clipping out the miniatures. I didn't clip them down quite as far as I could have, so I was cleaning up the nubs that are left behind. When it comes to mould lines, there are very few mould lines and they're very faint. You can clear them up just by using the back of your blade, etc., and just scrape it away. But really, they're so fine on the miniatures that I have that really it's no big deal if you didn't even bother doing it. Now, these miniatures do come in the base game, Guards of Traitors Toll, along with the villagers, etc. So if you haven't seen my review of the villagers, that would be my previous video. But yes, you can get these separately in their own little box, bought through, Wargames Atlantic or your friendly neighborhood store, etc. So with that said, let's get on to actually building these miniatures. Now, when I build the miniatures, I do use super glue, which a lot of people don't. I know a lot of people use their poly cement, etc., to paint their to glue their miniatures. Personally, I want a bit more of a quick bond. So I generally do use super glue instead of poly cement. But, it's up to you. If you like the idea of, playing around with the joins, getting them lined up exactly right, and that takes you a little bit of time, use poly cement. If you can do it fairly quickly, during the time that the super glue takes to activate, well, use super glue, because I think super glue is probably the better way to go for me personally, because one, it grabs it quicker and I'm not standing there for ages, and two, if the worst comes to the worst and I have messed up my join, I can pop them off more often than not, whereas poly cement tends to fuse the joint, etc. So yeah, that's why I use a super glue over poly cement. So placing the head on this body, as you can see, it fitted on really easily. All the arms and the heads that I have used have fitted on these miniatures really well. I can't say I found any problem with. They don't seem to quite fit, or they look, wrong. Some of the scales on some of the arms maybe aren't quite right, like this one holding the scroll. Maybe it looks a little bit shorter than maybe it should be, although that perspective is kind of twisted and it's hard to really relate. But as you can see, they go together really well. So for basing, I'm deciding I'm going to use these Renedra cobblestone bases. Now, I really like the Renedra bases because, they are the ones who come in the Frostgrave boxes, etc. And, Rangers of Shadowdeep, etc. So there's the same thickness, etc. Now, I clean up the sprue marks where I've cut them off. Obviously, you want a nice smooth base if you can get it. Generally speaking, I don't worry too much about it if there are some burrs or, what have you. But, I do try and clean it up as much as I can. So, for putting them on the base, so we have to cut off the pudding base, obviously. So, carefully go around the foot. Sort of go along the sculpture of the foot as you cut, and, cut just straight through the base. Now, clippers are easily strong enough to do this. Just make sure you don't cut the foot off, We don't really want to have to kit bash any peg legs, although that is quite an interesting idea, and I might actually give one of these guys a peg leg at some point. But I don't really want to do it with this. Now, the hardest part is cutting, like, the thickness of under the foot where the pudding base was. So be careful not to go too close to the foot, because as you cut, it can cut upwards and chop a bit of the foot off. So, cut a bit less than you would expect. And then super glue, or if you're using poly cement, Do that to the base of the feet and you can get them to stick. So this is why I like super glue, as you saw, is already stuck to the base. So for a skin colour, I'm going to start with doing the cork brown skin, which is my go-to skin colour. So there's not much skin on most of these miniatures because most of them are wearing helmets or armour, etc. So there's no exposed hands. But we do want to get a nice layer over the faces so that we can, get a nice coverage. Now, it might take a couple of coats if you've based them in a darker colour like I have. But, stick with it. Just make sure that you get a nice base coat on the flesh. So as I'm painting up this miniature, you will notice that I do swap between miniatures painting as I'm doing it, because I'm doing it kind of assembly line. Admitted it's only 6 miniatures, but it works to the same principle where if I'm using the skin colour, I may as well paint up everybody who has that skin colour. So next we have this yellow olive, and we're going to paint up one bottom quadrant of the miniature in this yellow olive. So the colour scheme I've decided to go for these ones is red, green and white. Maybe not white, but we'll play with it. So this is brought up by the Crafty Mini, who suggested I paint up something in the Welsh national flag colours. So that is red, white and green. So that's what the colours we're using here. So as you can see, I'm painting his right arm green, and so that means the lower left part of his uniform is also going to be green, because we're going sort of diagonal colours. So you will see in a minute that once we've done this, we'll go over to our next colour, which is a red. So Vallejo colour red, nice rich colour red. And this we're going to paint the opposite arm. So in this case, it's going to be his left arm and his right leg area of the uniform. So we got this diagonal. I like doing the quadrant painting. It does really make it stand out. I know not every soldier would have had quadrant painting, but my heraldry actually for both of the factions of Guards of Traitor Tolls are both quadrant coloured miniatures. You will see the other paint job that I have done later on in the video. But yeah, we're just being careful, making sure our red doesn't hit the green too much. We're trying to make a nice dividing line straight down the middle of his back by here, just trying not to hit the green if we can. Now, obviously, if you do, you can always clean it up later, we've gone back to the original colour, but I'm trying not to, less work if I can actually keep my brush under control and not hit those parts. But like with everything, don't stress too much, just, paint away and enjoy, try and find the enjoyment in this miniature. Speaking of this miniature, I do quite like the way that this guy is slightly more rotund for the guards. I kind of like that. Next, we got Speed Paint Camo Cloak. So I'm going to water this quite a bit down, make it slightly thinner than it is. It's coming out of the pot quite thick. And I want it to, just really slide over the miniature a little bit more. So this is going to be working as our shade for the green half or the green quadrants of our miniature. So I often use speed paints as my sort of shades because I find them quite useful for that sort of thing. I don't use speed paint generally as a finishing paint job, but I do use it as a quick and neat dirty wash, if you will. So I'll carefully go over that line, just try not to go into the red again, and I'm making sure really that I'm getting into the recesses of the miniature, because I know I'm going to come back and brighten this thing back up with the base coat later on. But for now, I want to get this especially into the sort of the shaded areas where I know I'm going to be keeping this colour. So I'm being careful to move around, keep the paint moving. But once you've got it where you think it is, leave it alone. Don't play with it too much as it's drying, because you will get strange sort of tide marks, etc. So now we're going for the blood red, I think, or gore red speed paint again. So this we're going to be using as our shade for the red colour. So we go over the whole miniature in this colour. Now I haven't watered this one down quite so much, because it doesn't cover quite as aggressively or as dark as the green does. So yeah, I'm going to go all over this miniature, and it's a really rich colour now. We've got some really nice looking colour build up. The original red that we used is a little bit dull, so this does give it much more vibrancy and much more like the Welsh flag. So now we're on to the flesh wash from Army Painter. Now this is my favourite flesh wash that I use, the Army Painter one. So I just give everything a good old douse in this, any of the skin, etc. So with this guy, I'm making sure I get it in his eyes and in the folds around his cheeks, etc. I put a little bit on his top of his head, but I do know that this is going to be lightened up later. So next we get the red that we started with and some dark vermilion, both made by Vallejo, and we're going to mix those colours together to give us a sort of an in-between shade of where we want to be. Now this is going to be hitting just about everywhere. It's going to be going all over the red areas, with the exception, of course, of the deepest, darkest shadows, etc. So wherever the fabric is stretched quite thin and is quite smooth, I'm going to go over it, just to give it that sort of colour, because where there's an awful lot of fabric being stretched out, it can look a little bit strange if you leave it too dark. So I'm lightening it up as if it's stretching across the armour, etc. I'm also making sure I hit the sort of the peaks of each of the folds in the cloth, because obviously they are going to be a high point and we want them to show up as a brighter colour. Again, separating the green from the red, I want to keep that sort of vibrant straight line so that it gives it the most contrast and pop from the opposite colour. Just go over it carefully, keeping an eye on, where you think the sun might hit, and anywhere where the fabric is going to be stretched out, which would obviously make the fabric look rather smooth, so you want to add a bit of this colour in order to show what's underneath the armour, so to speak. So next we're coming back with just the straight up dark vermilion, and we're hitting the very peaks of the folds, etc. The highest areas we want to show off. Now it doesn't have to be just the peaks, it doesn't have to be just the very highest parts of the fold. Like here, there is no fold really there, but it looked a little bit flat if I didn't put this bright colour on it. So I'm going to go back over and do a bit more bright colour, bring the colour of this fabric, which isn't in any of the shadows, etc. I'm going to bring it back up to the nice bright red. It's also quite a smooth area, so obviously, when we, like I said before, when we're painting smooth areas, we want to bring them up a little bit higher in colour, or I do anyway, because otherwise it looks just wrong. We need to add some brightness to that part of the fabric. So yeah, being careful, trying to pick out any of the folds, We're trying not to get it into the recessed areas, but if you do, there is no problem. We can always just chuck a little bit of that speed paint in order to get the shade back. Or even maybe the original, just the Vallejo red, which is kind of our darkest, basest colour. As you can see, this red now is becoming much more vibrant, much richer, and much more potent looking than that sort of dulled red that was originally painted on the miniature. It's becoming much more dragon red, I would say, than, say, crimson dark, dried blood colour, etc. So we're going to Army Green from Army Painter. Now this is going to be our highlight for our green areas on the miniature. So again, first thing that gets hit is the obvious folds in the fabric, so we're hitting again the peaks and trying to leave the troughs. I'm not going to be doing this one quite so aggressively. It's more in those raised areas that I am going to be hitting, not so much over sort of the mid-tone areas. If there isn't any lines, I'm drawing in a few little lines just to show some interest, because some of it's a bit flat and it might look a little bit boring. So if I draw in a few little fold lines or, some parts of the fabric where the sun is catching, that will give you some sort of interest as opposed to it all being kind of flat and kind of boring. Now, obviously, on this arm that is holding the parchment, that's where the most sunlight is going to hit, and that's where the fabric is kind of ruffled up the most. So you're going to be putting most of my highlights on this arm, because this is the arm that's raised up closest to the sun and is also causing the most ruffles in the fabric, etc., or the most raises. So then we're going over to a flat dark brown. I think this is Vallejo flat brown. And with this, I'm going to be painting the levers, etc. So these guys have a lot of belts. So I'm going to be painting all of those very carefully, trying to avoid hitting the greens and the reds that I've done on the uniform that are going to be obviously surrounding it. Now I do this at this point because obviously the belt's raised up from the uniform, so it's easier to paint it now than previously. Because generally speaking, the further the finger is out from wherever you painted before, it's going to be easier. You shouldn't really find it so hard to keep within the lines of the belt and, keep from hitting, nice semi-finished stuff. While I got the paint, I'm going to paint his trousers this colour, a nice brown. Seems about right for a guardsman, some sort of leather, or maybe even just a brown cloth, It seems like a good colour for like a lower classed sort of knight or a town's guard, etc. These are very well equipped guys, these town guards, so I'm assuming that they are, paid quite well, or at least given decent uniforms. So then we're going for this Natural Steel by Vallejo, and you guessed it, we're going to paint all the metal parts on him. So he has this nice neck guard, or a coif maybe, or aventail. I'm never quite sure which one is which, but yeah, the armor around his neck. So we're going to paint up this nice chainmail. So I'm getting a nice coat of it. If you wanted to, you could go a different way. You could paint it black first and then sort of dry brush the silver in order to catch that sort of the holes and the gaps in between the chain links. So I'm painting the silver on his sword, because it's this little, I'm not even sure what you call these things at the bottom of a sword, scabbard, but the bit that protects the bottom of your scabbard. I've decided that this guy is going to have a sort of a silver metallic blade instead of any sort of brass or bronzeness, so I'm going to paint also the pommel and the crossguard. While I'm here, I should really remember to do his belt buckle as well. So yeah, I'm going to carefully do the belt buckle. Now you don't have to be too sure about getting 100% coverage. Just get some silver on it and it will look okay from tabletop height. So I got some non-oil shade, an actual Citadel paint. Wow, I've had this for years and it's still going strong, so yeah, I'm still using it. So I'm going to hit all of the metal areas of the miniatures to give it some shadows and some, battered whatever. It just looks nice with a bit of this black wash. You can say it's whatever you want. It can be a shadows, which if it's a highly polished suit of armor, you are going to get a lot of different shadows bouncing off this thing. Or maybe it's like dirty, or whatever. It shows up as just more natural metal than just that bright silver, which doesn't look quite right without some sort of shade thrown on it. So I'm going to do the swords, armor, everything that's metal gets a little bit of a coat of a non-oil. So then we got sepia wash. This is also a Vallejo wash. Now I'm going to do over the leather parts with the sepia wash. Now the flat brown covered really well, but it's a little bit, dare I say, flat. So we're going to throw on some of this sepia wash in order to liven it up, give it some sort of variation. It's not too much one colour. So then we go to Speed Paint Dark Wood. So this is by Army Painter. And for this, I am going over the trousers. Now, I don't mind if I go really thick on this because the shadows of his tunic or his doublet or whatever you want to call that coat of arms coloured jacket thing that he is wearing, tabard, I would say. But yeah, it's all obviously throwing a shadow over his legs, so I'm going to be painting this on quite thickly because I'm not really that bothered. You don't see the legs too much, so I'm not going to be too worried about it. So next we're going with a dark grey. I can't actually remember what grey this is because I've handled it so much I've lost all of the writing on the side of the bottle, but it's a Vallejo, sort of dark medium grey. It's darker than the grey that we used before. And I'm going to paint up and tidy up the gloves and, the boots, anything that I'm going to want to keep as a dark leather. This is also the colour that I did my base coat with, so yeah, I'm keeping it back, getting it nice and clean again. So then we got this blue grey purple, very weird name for a paint, but it's a model colour Vallejo, and I'm going to do this on any sort of other parts that I can paint to bring in that sort of white colour. Now, as I was saying, I'm probably not going to paint the white of the Welsh flag. I'm actually going to make it this sort of blue, very pale blue grey, because that reads as a very pale colour, so it's close enough to white, and yeah, it just looks better on this miniature than a plain up white would look. So I'm going to be doing this on any accessories that I can add it to in order to add that third colour to break up this two-tone that I've managed to do with the red and green. So using Speed Paint Runic Grey from Army Painter, again another speed paint, but this time again I'm keeping it nice and watered down, and I'm going to go over sort of that blue colours that I just did. I'm going to work it into any of the crevices, etc., because this is going to be my shade. If I hit the helmet like I have here, I just wipe it off quickly before it's had time to dry. Otherwise, you'll get a strange stain on whatever you hit it on. So I'm going to make sure I've worked it into all of the crevices, etc. Now, I do sort of work on it a bit too long, and it did start leaving some weird marks on it. I did also sort of leave a very dark stain in some of the folds of his cloak, which I will have to come back later and clean up a bit more because they're just too dark. So with Elfic Flesh from the Vallejo range again. Now this is going to be like my white or paper colour, if you will, to paint up this scroll that the captain is brandishing, telling the people of some new city ordinance or something. So again, I'm going over a heavy color, a dark color, so it's going to take quite a few coats. So 2, maybe even 3 coats to make sure I get a nice even coverage over this dark grey that was originally on this scroll. So with the lanterns, now the lanterns are a bit of a faff for me. I'm not sure if I got it as good as I wanted it, but it will do. So I'm using the Elfic colour again, and I'm painting anywhere where the light is going to be shining out of the lantern. So I'm going to paint over all of the, like, they got like a filigree design going over the glass, a bit like a old leaded window, if you will. So I'm going to paint over the metal parts as well for now. Just paint them this colour, get them a nice light colour. We can always come back and paint in the metal later. So I decided to paint this guy's scabbard, this white colour also. So yeah, I am bringing in this white from the flag, at least in a few places. Although whether I'll actually keep it on the scabbard, I probably won't actually. So then I have Vallejo model colour brass. Now this is going to be my sort of bronzy, brassy colour that I'm going to use on the lanterns here. So I'm doing it on the filigree work. Now I would have been probably better off finishing the light effect before I did that part, but I was in a bit of a rush to get this miniature done, so I skipped it, and I really shouldn't have. I should have waited for the white to dry, just painted the lantern around those little filigree parts, and come back to them later on. But you live and learn. So yeah, painting up the whole lantern, this brassy colour. Then we're going back to that sort of light grey, the basalt grey, basalt, that grey. And I've decided I'm going to have my captain as a bit of an older gentleman, so I'm going to paint his hair grey, this very light grey, and we can sort of work from that colour to make it a bit more natural, because this very, very light grey is quite an unnatural colour, actually. Yeah, I don't know how to explain that. It's unnatural colour. It's not supernatural, but it's unnatural. We'll paint his moustache this grey also. So then the runic grey speed paint, that sort of bluish colour speed paint. We're going to paint his scabbard because that light grey, kind of blue-grey pale, could do with some interest, so we're going to do that. Then we're going to go back to the sepia wash, and this is to muddy up the scroll and make it look a little bit older, more weathered, etc. Now I'm going to paint this, muddy the scroll up a little bit first before I do any writing on it, because I am planning on using a pen to do it, and if you do the pen first, you may have troubles with the ink from the pen running. So next I am just putting water on the cloak, just brushing on a nice wet layer over the cloak so that my next stage will run better. So now I'm going to that sepia and I'm just dabbing it on, starting up quite high and letting it sort of just pool down into the bottom of the cloak. So because the water is on the miniature, it makes it slide much easier, reducing the resistance of the paint. So while I'm here, I've got this light grey that I used before, the basalt one, and I'm going to pick out the occasional cobblestone on each of the bases, just to make the cobblestone look a little bit more interesting for it. Now, I don't think too much about where I'm putting each of the colours. I'm just smacking on, let's say, a 4 or 5 on each one, and then moving on and picking a different one. So this is the skin colour, that cork brown. I'm just going to paint the occasional cobblestone just to make them stand out, make them look a little bit different. Each one will be slightly unique because I'm not going to try and memorize where I put each of these colors. But yeah, it does show that this ground was made of various stones. They're not all the same colors, etc. So while I've got this cork brown now, I'm going to pick out some of the pieces of this face. So I'm hitting his nose, hitting his brows, his cheeks, just to lighten him up a little bit. This is a very optional step because it looked pretty decent as it was. And around the back of his head, where there's a lot of clear skin, which really, it looked a bit shadowed. So I'm going to add a little bit more colour, make it look a little bit more interesting. Again, it's a very optional step. After putting the wash, it looks fine enough. So going back to that flat brown, I could have done this earlier if I had thought about it, but I didn't. So I'm going to paint a few more of those cobblestones, just randomly picking out a few and painting them in this very dark sort of flat brown to give it some interest. After which you could throw a wash on it to make it wash it down. It's up to you. So then we go to Zealot Yellow of the Army Painter Speed Paint. And this is going to be our sort of lantern effects. Now how you apply this, I'm not that pleased with how it ended up. It didn't look quite right. Now what I was trying to do was kind of putting the darkest, thickest bits of the paint down the bottom and working my way up, letting the top be slightly lighter than the bottom. But did it work? I don't think it really did. So coming back with that flat brown, because I've still got it on my palette, I'm going to paint these little wooden finials that are on the end of the scroll, which I'd forgotten about. And then with a pen, a very fine nibbed pen, I'm just going to scribble some nonsense on the scroll. And yeah, it's not perfect, but it will do from a tabletop standard. So I'm using that runic grey speed paint again, just to go over his hair, because it was that very unnatural bright grey. I immediately regret this. I didn't really think about how it was going to sit. I just wanted to get rid of that grey. So yeah, don't particularly like this, but I did it, so I'll roll with it. It's too late now. So then I go back to that basalt grey, while as you can see, the speed paint is still very wet, but I'm going to draw in some hair lines, etc., to try and add and break up this weird sort of mess that I've made. And it kind of works. I guess it's kind of like wet blending. And on the finished miniature, it looks pretty okay. But yeah, I wouldn't advise painting it this way. It wasn't what I meant to do, but it kind of worked in the end. And that's all we worry about. So let's get to have a look at a few of the miniatures finished up and painted. So as you can see, they turned out really nice. I really like this miniature range. I think the Guards of Traitors Toll box set is a really good box set if you want to play that game. And if you don't want to play that game, you can buy the miniatures separately from your friendly neighborhood gaming store, etc. Yeah, Wargames Atlantic, really like these miniatures. Keep it up. Really enjoyed painting them. So this is the second colour scheme that I tried, and this is the purple and yellow that my wife wanted to go with, so this is the colours I've painted up. So if you've liked this video, please leave a like. If you want to see more from me, please subscribe. And if you want to leave a comment, I do reply to every single comment. But until next time, it's going to be goodbye from me, Welsh Miniature Board Gamer.